Welcome to Glow State. I'm your host, Courtney Page. As a former executive recruiter, career coach, actor, and yoga teacher, I'm demystifying how people have designed the creative career and life that was meant for them, and how you can too. Now, for this week's episode, let's get glowing. Our Glow guest today is Alex Wolf. Alex spent nearly 20 years entrenched in the luxury hospitality space around the world, working for notable brands like Lore Group, Aperium Hotel Group, and Jean-Georges Management. At Jean-Georges, he worked his way up from assistant manager to director of restaurants, a coveted position that involved directing all of the New York City restaurants as well as traveling globally to open spaces for the brand. His work in the hospitality space showcased his unrelenting professionalism, creativity, and leadership abilities. Recently, Alex has pivoted towards the wellness arena, expanding his decades-long yoga and meditation practice. Alex, thanks for coming on.
I'm so happy to be here.
Yeah, it's been a while. Okay, so
that was, by the way, that was also an amazing bio because of the fact I feel like maybe I should hire you as my copywriter for like any like documents that I have to send to them.
I can send you that blurb and you can just put that on
great.
the top of all your stuff. Yeah, I love like doing the bio and then everybody has such a different reaction to it. Some people are like, oh, and some people are like, I need that. But okay, so you're back in New York, obviously.
Yes. Okay. Yeah. So I want to say I've been back for like a year and a month.
A year and a month. Okay. All right. So the first question that I like to ask everybody, just because I think it's a really fun question. If you were at a dinner party and someone came up to you and asked you, what do you do? What would you say?
Oh, that's such a good one. I feel like it changes week to week, but I would say probably that I'm in hospitality and keep it generic at first, figure out more information about them, and then figure out how I could explain it. Because, you know, with every role, it's like more complicated than it needs to be. And sometimes you want to extract more information and give the headline. You go anywhere else.
Love that. Yeah. What did you want to be when you were a kid?
God, that's such a good question. I feel like when I was a kid, I wanted to go to med school. I feel like I was interested in like psychiatry and, you know, just like more general, like things that had to do with being a doctor. Yeah, that was definitely like a path that I even considered it years ago. You know, everybody goes through their like moment in their 30s where they're like, should I try something different? And I think just the amount of school involved just was not for me. Like the whole med school thing was not something, and then residency, I don't think I could have survived it. But when I was a kid, it sounded really appealing.
Yeah. And yeah, everybody goes through that in their 30s and it's a real thing and there is a way out. Pivoting to doctorhood in your mid 30s would definitely that's like a big step because of all the schooling and you worked so hard. Okay. So hospitality, that's where I met you. How did you end up there?
Yeah. You know, I think, you know, it's interesting. I went to school with a lot of people who had like a very clear defined idea of where they wanted to go, right? Like they wanted to go to law school. They wanted to go to med school. I was always interested in political science more from the like idea of government as opposed to like being a politician, right? And so I was taking a lot of classes that were geared towards that. That was what I was going towards in school. And then what ended up happening is that I ended up, like most people, taking a job as like a side thing to like pay the rent and pay bills and things like that. And in the job, I just happened to get hired in like the most fine dining place of the city that I grew up.
Which
was
city?
Called the Gandy Dancer. It's in Ann Arbor, Michigan. So this is all built around University of Michigan. And so it's a ton of U of M kids who are going to school and also like actually working there. And it's a beautiful old renovated train station. So it is like an inspiring place to be in because it's one of those things where it's like the setting makes the scene of the entire space. I don't really think that the food was really that important to anybody who was going there. But ultimately, it was like a cool restaurant. It had a cool story in that it was a family restaurant that the owner, I don't know if you remember that book, The Perfect Storm, that was then turned into a movie with George Clooney. Okay.
And
So,
I'm from the Boston area. So that's
oh, okay.
like, yeah,
You very much know it.
I know about it. Yeah.
Yeah, it's part of the whole catalog of information that you've got stored. It's actually the owner died in that storm. He was on a boat during that storm. And so eventually the family ended up selling, but I had joined during that time. So there was just like a lot of mythology going on. It was a cool space, but I started, I think, as a host. And then I worked as a host. I worked as a server. I touched like pretty much every single job that I could. And it was back in the days, like it's weird. Like now, I think God, things are so easy. But back then, if you wanted to move around, you had to like try out all the jobs that you probably wouldn't have to touch now. So it was like I was in the prep kitchen and doing things with like breaking down fish and things like that, like things that were more culinary focused jobs that I don't really think that anybody would force anybody to do now because they think that it was either inefficient or it was a waste of time for the company. But actually, I think ingeniously enough, it was a good way of planting like a touchstone to like every portion of it, as opposed to people who are just, this is my bubble and I only understand
Right.
this portion of it. Right. But I was bouncing around from all of these roles and I really liked them. And I think, I was going to school full time while I was doing that and working full time. And this is like at a time where like nobody cared about overtime. So it's like everybody was all too happy. You want to work 8 doubles in a row? Have at it,
Go
right? Like,
for
and I
it.
was like, yeah, exactly. We're not counting your hours here. And so they ended up offering me a role as like an associate director of sales, which is like a banquet manager per se. And so I was in charge of booking all of these events and they had this beautiful courtyard area. So it was like weddings and like charitable functions and all that. And then for some reason, after I'd been doing that for a little bit, they just kept on giving me more and more promotions and they kept on like pulling me in and pulling me in. And eventually I was like having such a good time with it. It was like, why am I continuing on with school when I actually am enjoying this so much more? And I think, like I really think to not be a hater on organized education because I truly believe in it. I really do think if you're somebody who doesn't have like a clear endpoint in undergrad, I think grad schools are like amazing. I think undergraduate programs can kind of suck the soul out of the educational process because you're stuck 500 people in a class and you're given all of these prerequisites that don't necessarily have anything to do with what you want to do. A big university like that, I think that led me to also be like, you know what? This is kind of a nameless, faceless institution, even though I know it so well. I'd rather be doing this other thing that seems more exciting. Like, you walk through a dining room and it's like electric, there's energy, there's things going on. If for somebody who like wants to like be in the action of it when you're young, it feels a lot more engaging than perhaps like poring over books till 3 a.m, researching something that nobody's going to be interested in like 4 years from now.
And that like doesn't necessarily serve you like when you're 35.
100%.
Yeah.
So it worked for me. And so then I just kept on taking opportunities when I could get them.
That's awesome. So what brought you to New York?
Okay. Yeah.
So you're in Ann Arbor, you're loving it. You stopped school because you're like, I'm making soap money and this is so much more fun and energizing.
Yeah. Yeah.
What led you away from that whole space?
Yeah. Well, you know what? I think I'm like the poster child for somebody who likes to like think that they have like a linear plan, but nothing has been like planned out. Things have veered left and right, and they've always been perfect for me. If I were to put it on paper, I think people would think that I like was strategic about it. I absolutely was not. It was just like things just happened and I was like, oh, I'm going along with this. So what ended up happening was I left that group because the person who I reported into, he was opening a small fine dining restaurant near there that was in the heart of Ann Arbor. It sounds crazy now to say it, but back then it was so abnormal. It was run by a female chef. So she was chef owner, which was like not something that you saw in those days. She was also going towards her certification in wine to like a high level, which was nobody knew about back then. Right. So there was just a lot of things that were really interesting about it. And I'll be honest, like I'm a design enthusiast and kind of like an aesthetic snob. And so the space was really incredible. And so all of those things led to me going there. I was there for about a year, but like at a certain point, you max out what your potential is. You can only go so high and it's not yours. So I ended up joining a group that had like 15 restaurants across 4 states and was based in the same city and was working towards like becoming a director of training, like really thought that I'd just stay there. And I worked with this one chef who I loved, like funniest guy, like really smart, probably could have been done a lot more than he did, but he was like really successful, just taking it easy. And one of the things that he had told me, his story had taken him from Ann Arbor to New York and then back to raise a family. And he told me that you weren't really in the industry until you went to one of the big 3 cities. And the 3 cities back then, obviously it's totally different now, but the 3 cities back then were San Francisco, New York, and Chicago.
When was
And
that? Like
that was
what?
probably 2003, I want to say,
Okay.
somewhere around there. And so it's like before like Food Network created tons of culture in small
Mhm.
cities and like all the things that you have as opportunities now didn't really exist in the same way back then. And San Francisco seemed like too far and not where I wanted to be. Chicago was too close and quite frankly, too Midwest. And then New York was like a reach. It was a challenge. It was like, could I do this? And I ended up applying to a job that was there and it was a John George management post. And I flew out to New York and I got the position the same day and then had like frantically a week and a half to
Of
move to New
course.
York because of course, they're like, we need you to start next week, which
Yeah.
was unhelpful, exciting, but unhelpful.
Yeah, I feel like that's how a lot of New York stories start. You get a job and all of a sudden it's like, you need an apartment tomorrow and
Yeah.
go. Yeah. And it's exciting and nerve wracking and all of that. That's so interesting. I never knew that about you. Like you were just this like hotshot Mercer manager when I met you. And
Oh yeah. Those are the
yeah,
days. Those are fun times though. Those
those,
are some of the best times. Yeah.
I know that was like an era. I don't even know if I ever told you this, but you were definitely super influential in my ability to appreciate and actually organize. Like before I worked at Mercer, I was a mess and I did not understand the importance of organization. And that was something that you and Little Miss Z were like, girl, get it together.
Okay, so I was lucky. I know in my industry, when I was first coming up as a little bit the Wild West, I came into like more established groups. But really all it takes is for someone to be present who maybe doesn't have a skill set that you don't have yet, but is like, oh, you are aware of them, right? And you suddenly start to absorb that. And I think the perfect scenarios of working for organizations are and the thing that I would tell everybody now, the first thing that I would look for in an organization is a person you report into, whether you feel like they're trustworthy and whether you feel like you can immediately understand that you will speak a common language and there'll be a common respect, right? Because there are so many examples of people who thrive because people above them don't see them either as adversaries or don't see them as like, their success as being detrimental to theirs, right?
Right.
I don't know. It's interesting, but in that environment, I think that we worked in, it was such like a all hands on deck. Really, the backstory with that is the restaurant, through no fault of anyone's, I hadn't been there before, so I can't criticize it. But we really were in a turnaround space for that restaurant. All of us as managers were brand new. I had never had an experience working a day in the building. We brought on a bunch of people, but then there were people like you who came in second generation were like the most important people for us because, you were burning off people who might have remembered the way that it was and might not want to be with you on this new journey. Right. And
Yeah.
that's okay, but then it's those newer people who you want to protect the most because they sense the instability of the older people being like, I don't want to be here. It's not what it was. There's like a middle ground of people who you've worked with before who trust you. And then there's like the newer people who are like, what is this? And what's happened here? And
But like, I want to be in there.
But no, I think it was just a really special time because it felt like everybody was all in.
Yeah.
Which is rare for any organization,
Yeah, it was definitely a very electric time. And I wasn't there that long, but it was so fun. And I think one major, I don't know what you would call it, but takeaway, I guess, is the fact that I made you as a friend. I made Zainab as a friend, and you
Yep.
guys are like lifelong people. Like you're not going
Hmm.
anywhere. And that
Exactly.
I think is a testament to the environment that you created. And so you left Mercer and went on to JG not headquarters, their flagship restaurant as
Yeah.
GM, which is like a crazy job. It's on Fifth Avenue. It's loaded with big names all the time. The food is like precision perfection, gorgeous culinary art. If you've never, like, you have to go just sit at the bar. It's so good. And you just were like the boss and you were amazing at it. Was that something that you really enjoyed, or was that, because to me, that sounds super stressful because it's like a huge job. But was it something you enjoyed? Like, were you just in flow the whole time?
You know what? It was a really dynamic time to be there because, the way that restaurants in New York work is that they're on these cycles, right? Of review, then it's about maintaining, then it's a review, right? And
Mm.
so like Michelin works in that every single year you're seeking to earn it. We were in a cycle where we knew part of the reason why I believe that I was brought back was because I think that I had an experience inside the building, right? And I had trust with some of the major stakeholders who were there. And I think everybody knew that we were in a major review cycle. And we had just gone through a period in the city where like three of the four-star restaurants had been dinged by the New York Times and either brought down in
Right.
their number of stars. So it was like a, will we be able to execute this? So it was like a really interesting, very high stakes time. And we were able to, I think, create a really cool team who were there for a very long and stable amount of time. And, to go through that New York Times review process, to go through kind of like expanding the business in different ways than it had been before. It was a really dynamic time there. It was also a cool time in the company, and that was a company that was going through this transformation of being like, they had been around since the 80s, like the bones of the company, but they were growing at that point very massively. They were starting to really invest in more development. They'd always been successful, but then there was a renewed push as an EVP who had previously been with them came back to the group.
Okay.
And so there wasn't like at the corporate level, right? There were these players who were like the president, the founders, the owners, that EVP. There really wasn't like a ton of corporate resources. So as a general manager, you were touching a lot of group level things. You
That's
started
amazing.
to
That's an
like,
amazing opportunity.
oh, absolutely. It was like, that allowed me, when I was at Mercer to start participating in my first openings to kind of see what it's like, get the lay of the land. And in that, I really did fall in love with first of all, the openings with the process it's a highly addictive process because
Why?
you're going in, well, you're like literally creating something and you're seeing it unfold. And there's a lot of high stress and a lot of pressure, particularly from construction, the hiring process, receiving goods and getting everything to where it needs to be. It's all happening at the same time in real time. Oftentimes for a group like that, you're existing inside the space as a hotel operator. So like we were external from the hotel operator, but we were sharing a space with them and theoretically reporting into them. And so that relationship can be difficult to navigate, right? There's a lot of times where it devolves into like difficult backbiting and things like that. We didn't necessarily have that, but you don't know each other at the beginning. So there's a lot of trust that has to go in. There's a lot of layers of people that you don't really know that you have to hand things off to and trust that they're going to be there. And it's like a weird thing where us being the restaurants on property or the food and beverage, leaders, the hotel group would really run project management, but then you'd have to run your own because you couldn't trust that somebody else is going to do it for you. So it'd be
Right.
like, there was a critical path and there was a, kind of like a project management scheme that existed underneath that umbrella. If you're the first person who's there, you're paying attention to construction on the kitchen, construction in the dining rooms, where things are at, making calls about like whether you think things are feasible or not, whether hiring possibilities are there or not, whether you'll hit your
Mm.
timetables, some of which are tight because banks agree to them. So it's just a high pressured, high stakes environment that literally you always feel like it's never going to come about in time. And like literally, there's always like a moment a week before you open where you're like, why did I choose to do this? This is such like this is like a bad decision in my life. And then the day of, when everything comes together, the dining room looks beautiful, and like before, and you see the team starting to like really gel and find a cohesive rhythm with one another. That's when it gets really exciting. And I also love activations. I love PR events and things that you stage to get live. So that was also really fun to participate in. And yeah, I was able to travel across the globe. So it's amazing.
I really wanted to know about the travel aspect. So
Yeah.
first, I'm going to backtrack just for a second,
Yeah.
because I think something that you were talking about, the pressure of it and the high stakes aspect of opening a restaurant. And now we have TV shows where we can like watch it and it's dramatized and it's like, kind of romanticized and all that.
Hello,
It's like, oh,
Vanderpump.
wow. Yeah. What is it about type of environment and that type of experience where the pressure is really high and the stakes are really high that jibe with your personality?
Okay, so there's a couple things that are healthy personality traits and a couple things that I feel like we all have that are unhealthy personality traits.
For
I
sure.
think the unhealthy side of it would be, like the desire for perfectionism and maybe like this need to prove to yourself that you can do things. There is a certain part of it that like you have to feel like everything reflects on you and that you kind of need it, right? I think somebody who's self-sufficient might not want to put in all of the hours or might not want to, like somebody who has a certain baseline of like, I just want it to be calm, easy, and I'm not really trying to prove anything to anyone. I don't know that's necessarily the right role for them because of the fact that there's so much layers. There's so many hours that go into it that it just might not be worth it. But if you're somebody who really wants to physically be able to like say what you've done and show what you've done, it's very rewarding, right? Because it seems like it might have come across the finish line. And if you're able to push it across the finish line, it really does provide a huge sense of validation and like a self-esteem boost. It's very like addictive in like a dopamine way, right?
Yeah, that's what I was thinking. Yeah, it's like a
Yeah,
dopamine drop. Yeah, like
100%,
yeah.
100%. The other thing that I think is really, I think you have to have it in it. There's this weird duality of having a high level of attention to detail or being around people who have a high level of attention to detail and absorbing that from them, while at the same time being able to rate what you have to let go by necessity and what to hold on to, because it's impossible to control everything. But I think the awareness of everything where it's at globally is something that you have to maintain, even if you're not able to fix everything. I think a strong sense of prioritization of saying my time is best used over here versus over here, I think helps to make it manageable, because otherwise you could have somebody who's, and I've seen it where you have somebody who has very high level of attention to detail who get stuck in like weeds and then can't get themselves out. And you have to understand that you still need to be 500 feet above. If you're stuck in like too many small details, you're really not going to pull it together. So it's just like a combination of things that I think probably come from like a mild case of OCD, that like,
Yeah.
that like
Yeah.
made it very appealing and feel very rewarding every single time I went through it.
Yeah. How long did it take you to kind of realize, as a very detail oriented person, that you were not able to have your hands in everything and that you had to delegate? Was that a pretty quick realization? And then once you did realize it, was it easy? Were you like,
Yeah.
okay, no, I can't do it, and I know exactly who I'm going to delegate to? Or was it like, what am I doing? How do I delegate?
First off, one of the things that I think was really beneficial, like every other person, I'd say this to anybody who's a Gen Z or any other generation that's going to come up. We all wanted to skip every step and be at the end of the road. Like I totally wanted to do that. I never was able to. Like I worked in all the restaurants in New York. I like went through all the positions. I had all the backdrop. So I think I had a strong faith in my ability to understand everything, where I think if I had skipped a step, it really would have harmed me to be as effective as I ended up being in that particular role in that space. And the other thing that nobody ever tells you in any business is that you pay people to make mistakes, right? So there were definitely mistakes that I made. Anybody who goes into any new role is going to make mistakes that are going to cost time, going to cost money, going to cost energy, going to cost effort. And hopefully they learn that that then becomes mistakes that they will never make again. For example, I did not do a great job in my first project overseeing the dish tank, which meant that then every other project, it was the first thing that I looked at, right? Because it can totally sink you if you haven't thought out the dishwasher and things that might not be the shiniest objects for you to be planning.
Yeah.
I do think that the mistakes help shape like what you drop and what you don't drop because you start to see that some of the areas that you invest your time in are less important than others. And the other thing that I always had is as jaded as you can get in New York and as like,
Rough.
pessimistic as a lot of people are. I always had a strong belief in people. And so it wasn't so hard for me to like pass things off, as you said, to people who are on the project, even knowing them for a short period of time. I felt like I was able to show them that I trusted them genuinely and honestly. And I think then
Mhm.
we worked well together. I think if I had been skeptical, had micromanaged them, had like been more obvious in my concern about their capabilities, right? Or if I had like spent a lot of time hovering over them, I think I would have also been far less successful. But I do think
Mhm.
that like deep down, I have a very positive view of other people and have faith that most people are not trying to do things maliciously. It's just that like if there's a
Mhm.
mistake made, it's just through a lack of awareness. I think if I didn't have that, I think it would have been hard to be successful because these things are all about teams, you know?
Yeah, yeah. And I think that whole idea of refraining from micromanaging is a really difficult thing to do for high performers and yourself, detail oriented people. I know a few in my life, and they have a really hard time not micromanaging and not hovering. And I think what you're saying is really important in just having the faith in yourself for hiring that person. Like you didn't hire that person on a whim. You interviewed them and you made the concerted effort to go into their background and figure out if they fit, and you hired them. And then so that's like faith in yourself, in your own judgment, and then giving them the space to prove themselves, basically, is what you're saying. And if they don't, then they don't. And if they do, then you have that mutual trust is, like you said, so important and so integral in creating a team.
I think if you're too afraid of mistakes being made, it's really hard to operate large scale projects and get them through from a
Because they're going
project
to be
management
made.
perspective.
Like they're just going to be
Exactly.
made. Yeah. There's no
Exactly.
way to go through that without making one.
It's really like the resolution of those mistakes that's the most important thing, right? There's
Mhm.
always going to be something that requires a go back or like a review or like doesn't work out the way. And I think that the pivoting is probably the ability to pivot is another thing that's incredibly important because if you get so fixated on the way that something looks, it almost never looks the way that you envision it in your head in reality and sometimes evolves into something quite different. I think one of the things that worked well for me with Jean George is because each space was designed by a different person. Each space had a different intention behind it, a different vibe, a different energy. I never personalized the brand. I see a lot of people who personalize the brands based on what they think, right? How they look at it, which can be helpful in some scenarios, but in others are not because you're not always going to be the demographic that it's catering to. You're not always going to be the person who's going to be a representative of the clientele, right? You have to
Mhm.
come to it with like a little bit of emotional detachment and look at it through the prism of what the brand wants to be, not whether you like it or not. And I think that's
Right.
incredibly important for all the strong project managers that I've seen and worked with in my career. They always are detached emotionally from what the end decision is. It's like, okay, it might be totally different than the one that I would want, but I just want everybody to make a decision. You
Right.
have to like really just be tapping people and pushing people for results and decisions. And but if you get invested in what the decisions are, I think it would be really hard to manage projects effectively.
That's so interesting. It's so interesting. I like that idea of being a little bit emotionally detached because I think when you get super emotionally attached to something that is very, in business, there's a lot that can kind of unravel with that. And there's a lot more, there's just a lot more of a chance for disappointment. And
Totally.
yeah. But I want to talk about traveling. So you're
Yeah.
at John George, and because I know travel is personally a really big thing for you. So it wasn't like a huge surprise when I heard you were like globetrotting around like to all these cool places with this like cool job. How did that job present itself to you? And like, was it an easy yes? I feel like it was an easy yes, but
Yeah. So I was super interested in the entire development sphere when I was at John George. Like I would never have said it to them because I think that they would have thought that I would have neglected maybe perhaps the operational piece that I was like in charge of. That was like really a lot of ways like my day job that was paying my salary. But like a huge portion of what I did was development and was learning was development in a lot of different ways. And that was what was interesting to me. So like years ago, I never lost caring about operations, but development was what enticed me and excited me. Spaces,
why?
where they were, what they were doing. I think it was the creation of things. I think
Mm,
the idea of like building a product and like seeing it come to life, people included. Like I don't think of it as just like an abstract like four walls, you know? But I think being a part of that is very different than existing inside a space. You know, there's like for me, what my career has evolved into is a lot of the creative side of the business, which originally was very operational on the execution and tactical side of the business. And that's where I started being not necessarily the decision maker with things that were creative, but participating and running parallel and being in charge of making sure that these creative decisions were made and executed the way that they were supposed to be. And so I love that. And it just so happened that like the way that a group like that works, especially as much visibility as he has, is that you own several spaces. His were all in Manhattan and you sign licensing deals and based on interest and his, because he was such a global chef, starting in France, then traveling throughout Southeast Asia, being known for bringing Asian food to the United States and like kind of being involved in a fusion of sorts. He
John
was very
George. We're
appealing
talking
to
about John
people. Yeah,
George, just to
yeah,
clarify.
John
Yeah.
George von der Eschen, yeah, and was very appealing internationally to international guests. And then also, you know, the existence in the Michelin guide. Michelin is not like such a strong. I think it's getting more of a strong connotation amongst Americans. Americans didn't really care for a long period of time because it wasn't super present for us. But
Mm,
for international travelers, the Michelin guide was like the be all end all. So everybody knew his name and that was traveling from Asia or Europe, et cetera. And that was like a check mark. So those people then open spaces and then they want to find somebody who's going to increase the visibility of whatever space it is. So they
okay.
sign something. And so it ended up being in all of these spaces that were really interesting. I had nothing to do with choosing where the spaces were, but I certainly had no problem putting my life on hold and going to any of them. You know, for me, it was almost like getting, you know, you'd go for 2 to 3 months to a different area and you'd get to try on a like there, you know, that you never normally would if you were just visiting for like 5 days or for like a week or whatever. So whether it
Right.
was
Yeah.
London or Singapore or Sao Paulo, you know, it was ultimately something that was really interesting. And I just still love travel. I think it's eye-opening. I think, especially when you're in a city that's international like New York, where you get a lot of people, it may pique your
I was
interest
thinking
even
that.
more,
Yeah.
you know, because you're like, okay, well, this is like really interesting, but where are all these people from? Right. And it just makes you want to see more. I do also say that there's like what I like, be careful what you wish for, because at a certain point, you know, I think in 2017, I was like home for a month that entire year. And it was like we
Mm.
had 9 openings across the globe. It was like
9.
back to back. Yeah. 9 openings across the globe.
Wow.
And so sometimes I think what I've realized is that I do like travel, but I like it to be controllable travel. So I understand why that first boots on the ground, like I did it for a long period of time. It really is like somebody who's, I wasn't that young when I was doing it, but a young person's game,
Yes, you
because
were.
well, you do have to sacrifice so much for it, right? And it can be incredibly rewarding and exciting. I think that there's always like a time expiration point for doing it as intensely. Coming to a property for like a week or so, totally different than being there for like 2 months to 3 months
Yeah.
and then moving on to the next. But it was such a great thing. And I'm so fortunate that I was able to participate in that way. So yeah, now I feel like I'm a little bit, because I spent so long traveling professionally for work. Now I am like craving personal travel and more protective of it. Like I want it to be like
Mhm.
my thing that I control
Yeah.
entirely. But yeah, it was amazing. And, it allowed me not only with Jean George, but with the other groups that I've been with to really explore and see and even live outside of the United States, which was fun.
Yeah. And I wanted to ask you about that. But first, where did you end up going with John George? What?
So I went to, let's see if I can remember all the places. So in the United States, obviously, ton of work in New York, Beverly Hills, Miami, our personal favorite,
Our
our
personal favorite.
connection. Yeah.
So good.
Um, and then there I opened in London, in Singapore, in Sao Paulo. I was in Dubai. There were a lot of places that we ended up going to, but those were like the openings that I led more or less.
Yeah. Which one like vibed with you the most?
Good question. I, out of all of them, I would say I enjoyed London the most, but it was like also because it was like a very boutique space. It was like the package was small. It wasn't like the hugest project that we had going on, but it was in like a beautiful hotel that is like one of the most revered in the city.
What hotel?
And it's the Mayborn Group is Claridge's, which most people know about because of the fact that
Yeah.
the Royals go there, and it's like the most high profile. It's two sister properties, Barclay, which is probably their most casual, which is not casual at all, but it's their most casual like interpretation. And then the Connaughts, which is located in this beautiful area of Mayfair, which is like,
Mhm.
very upscale area of London. And it's very historical in its makeup. You have like the banisters that take you up 10 floors, and everything
Oh,
feels like
wow.
very ornate, and it feels very bespoke, and everything's hand carved, and, the flowers are gorgeous. It's very old school British in a
Mhm.
way. And the space that we opened in was very modern, but it still was very refined. And I was also coming towards the end of my time with Jeff George. I was able to appreciate it. Often when you're in roles, you never appreciate things until they're over. And I
Right.
think I was able to actually appreciate it more and enjoy it more. And I just love London. So it was like all of that.
Me too. We should go to London together.
I would be happy to. I
Oh
would
my
be happy to.
gosh. Yeah, that's so funny. So I was just talking to somebody the other day about just like geography and how sometimes you can just go to a place that you've never been before and you feel home. And
100%.
yeah, and I just think that's such a cool phenomenon. And I was actually in London right before the pandemic. That was like the last international travel that I did before the pandemic, and having 1,000 children who now prevent me from going out of my house. But and London was the last place we went on our little thing. We went to Paris, Amsterdam, and London. And I just felt like, oh, I could live here an hour into just walking around the city. I love that. And I love when a new city just like resonates with someone immediately. So what
It always
about
surprises you
London?
too, which what it is.
I will say London wasn't totally surprising to me because I have been obsessed with anything British and TV for since like
What's
childhood.
in
I
your
was
blood?
yeah, and like tea and the whole thing. I was just like I think this is like an ancestral pull towards like
Mhm.
I don't know. And I grew up horseback riding, but for you, like what was it about London that you were just like, I love it here?
So I think with London, first of all, any place is going to be hard to move to after New York, which is, I'm sure, what people say about like most major cities, right? Like you get acclimated to certain things, you feel
Mm,
comfortable in a certain way. I think London's big enough and it has as much of like similarities in some ways with New York that there's a comfort level there, right? That there's a
yeah,
continuity of energy, size of space, et cetera. I think it's equivalent amount of citizens, and, there's a lot of areas to check out. And there's things that like, if you're familiar with New York, you might say, oh, this reminds me of this area in New York, or you might do the same thing if you're in London, right? And there were just enough differences that I think made it interesting. The age in the city is interesting. as an American. We are, all of our cities are very young. And
Mm.
even though New York is one of the older cities that we have, London, just like from a historical perspective, like you feel it when you're there. It
Totally.
also feels modern, right? I think the other thing about London that's surprising that I don't really think I got when I first went there, or even the second or third times I went there, but when I moved there, I really understood is that London was a city that was built to be civilized in some ways. Like every neighborhood has a
Hmm.
green space. Like they very much value parks.
Yeah.
Every neighborhood like centers around a green space. Like it definitely
Beautiful
feels
parks, like
a hundred
amazingly gorgeous
percent,
parks. Yeah.
100%.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I was just
Where
gonna
did
say,
you
I
walk
remember
to?
walking through Hyde Park, which is like
Yeah,
it's like the big one. This is so stupid, but we were like walking and there is a trail in Hyde Park for horses. And I was
I
like,
learned to horseback ride on that trail during the
no
pandemic.
way.
Yes, yeah. So I like made a decision that during the pandemic, I would pick up a skill and learn a new one every single year. And something that I had theoretically put on a bucket list, but that I wanted to do. And so it's Hyde Park Staples operates in there. There's another riding stable that exists there, but they've been very well known for like over 100 years and they
Okay.
operate inside of it. And so every Sunday I would go there to have
Stop. Oh my
lessons.
God. That makes me so
Yeah,
happy. Yeah. I just remember that's so funny because that was like one of the biggest parts of London for me that I like remember. I was
it was wonderful.
That is so cool. Like it's just what you were talking about. It's like the modern and tradition really like meet there. And the other space in London that I always think is just the coolest spot. Oh my God, I'm gonna forget the name of it. I think it's Piccadilly, where like there's that big
Yeah.
screen and then it's surrounded by these ancient buildings, but there's like that massive like wraparound screen. Is that Piccadilly?
It's almost a more tasteful version of like Times Square where it doesn't feel
Yeah.
like quite as overwhelming, right? And it's not like the M&M's building everywhere.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's like that, the contrast. It's so much more obvious in London. And I think because London has a certain amount of density, you don't see it. Amsterdam isn't as big, Paris
Mhm.
isn't as big. London is a larger city and
Yeah.
like feels more imposing in the way that they built it, right? So I think the contrast in a space like that totally shows more. You feel like
That's interesting.
really
Yeah.
like, where am I? But it definitely does. It's a cool city in that it intersects both, but it is softer than New York. It is. And I think that can be appealing because it feels like to some people, maybe it might feel feeling cosmopolitan, still having a ton of energy, still having diversity, but softer, you know?
Cool. Yeah. And so you left John George while you were in London and then ended up going to.
So I went to Perriam as like a
Okay.
bridge. And so I was there for like a year and it was like a company was built in the Midwest. So like really like small hotels in secondary and third markets that were underserved at that point that they would find historical buildings and renovate them into boutique hotels that then
Oh, cool.
created conversations. And they would work to really incorporate the community, whether it was like through craftsmen, designers, like businesses, etc. So really create a community hub and be the first to start a conversation, whether it's in Minneapolis or Detroit, or we operated in Memphis and like quite a few Midwestern cities.
Okay.
And
That's
now
so
they've
big. I
expanded
mean,
south. Yeah.
yeah. Okay. And so, yeah, you weren't there for as long as you were in any of the other places that you worked. What was it
No.
about it that you were like, maybe not?
You know what? I moved to Chicago for the role. And I think Chicago was like, how you said that like London was a place that you felt like home immediately. I'd grown up going to Chicago and I immediately felt like Chicago was at home. I loved it for the
Okay.
time period that I was there, but I never really felt settled. I also was at a point in my life where, and I think it's really important that people understand this because people don't listen to themselves, but
Mm.
sometimes companies can be amazing, but not be perfect for you. And it's not because they're negative and it's not because you're negative. It's just not a fit. And I think for me, I recognized that very early with Imperium. I loved the aesthetic as a guest. Everything didn't fit me like a second skin. And so I was pretty honest with the ownership about it and stayed on through the end of the year because they had quite like a challenging schedule to go through. And then but one of the amazing things that I had there is I had worked with this young woman who was incredibly intelligent, just like in development for that group. and she could model out a building in 5 seconds, like understood everything, like worked quick,
Just quick.
got everything, tons of fun, playful. And she was also from New York. She was transplant. So we immediately got on, became great friends, fast friends. And she was the one who ended up moving to Lore Group. And then as I was
I see.
trying to decide what I would do, she was the one who pulled me into conversations with Lore. And then when I went to Lore, the thing that I loved about them was their scale was much bigger than a Perium scale. And it was an owner operator. So it's the first time that I took away like thousands of owners, thousands of different like layers, and you're representing the owner. And that was very appealing. Felt like a much more clean way of doing business. And it was a family business. It was the smallest portion of their business. And they were building hotels that they wanted to stand this test of times in major cities. And so because they were this huge business, it was benefit that they had a lot of capital at their disposal. So like the projects were interesting and exciting, and they were in cities that I liked. I loved all three of the cities that we operated in: London, Washington, D.C., and Amsterdam.
Oh, those are great cities.
Yeah, I love all three of them.
Yeah.
And I actually think Washington, D.C. is very underrated. Like I think people dislike it for some reason, mostly because of politics. But I think it's such a cool city, beautiful architecture. I love walking neighborhoods in Washington, D.C. I just think it's really idyllic in some ways. With that job, they were trying to decide between either hiring someone local as like a subcontractor, so like to license.
Were they based in London?
So they were based in New York at that point. So they had an office in New York and an office in London.
Gotcha.
And so they were centralized in New York, and they were doing their first US property, which is in Washington, D.C., and Riggs, Washington, D.C. And it was this beautiful building, catty cornered to like the National Portrait Gallery. It's like terracotta stone building, really stately, really beautiful, right in the city center. And, when it was previously Riggs National Bank, which is known as the Bank of Presidents. And so it's just a really cool building, a lot of history there. And what happened was that I went to see the space and I fell in love with the interior as soon as I saw it, like these soaring 24-foot high ceilings, marble columns. And then I met the lead designer, Yaku Strauss. He's the creative director for the group, and his design director, Katrina O'Sullivan. Their aesthetic I loved. And so I was like, oh, I could definitely create around this, or create, I guess I would say, contiguous with this, like make it parallel with everything that like you felt from the hotel front. Yeah, 100% synergy. Yeah, I felt like this is like a fruitful relationship. So yeah, the majority, I definitely was still running operations, but I also got to touch acquisitions because they bought buildings, asset management. So like I had been in the position of people checking in with us about finances and about all of these things. I was on the opposite side of those conversations now, where I was working with people after we acquired who were in restaurant spaces, et cetera, before we decided to like take them on, and working with them to manage financials, et cetera, quality control issues, et cetera. And then really planning out opening that space. And then it became, we flipped all of the spaces. And so really, I think while Perium was touching everything inside a hotel group and being internal with the hotel group and really mastering that, I think with Lore Group, it was the entire creative side of things. So from then on, I was part of the strategic group that was leading the process with branding, with, a lot of different key, drivers for the hotel brand, like obviously that was not my purview, but my brands fed into it and needed to have a red thread that went through them. I had participated in lighting and in music, and there I took those on as kind of like my two projects of scene setting and music curation. And so those have become some things that have like stayed with me. And then I would do like everything from uniform design to with the design team, selecting and curating all of, the plateware, the visuals for the interiors, et cetera. And then the creative drive for the menu. So this is like before Jean-Georges definitely had a sphere where I was participant, but he had a culinary focus. Now my job was to take, chefs and have them broadcast themselves in the best way to the world while interpreting this brand
Cool.
was a part of it. Yeah. So that was a huge portion of it. So it was really the creative sides of the business were the things that I loved touching the most and really inspired me there. It was exciting. The company did change from being based in New York to being based in London, which was the impetus behind my move to London. And I got on a plane to move to London on, I remember very clearly, March 7th of 2020.
I remember. I remember.
So worst timing ever. But you know what? It all happened for a reason. In the end, they currently have 6 hotels. All those hotels have been flipped. I've worked through all the concepts on them. So I feel very proud about what the team and I were able to do with it. And it feels like it was like a very good next step, maybe a logical next step from what I had done before.
Yeah. And I think the constant thread that I'm seeing is, first of all, this balance between the kind of logistical, technical aspect of business, in your case, hospitality business, and the creative. Like you were clearly pulled toward the creative, and you are very obviously affected by spaces and the feel of a space. And, that is something that I think is resonates with the creative soul, right? I love that you didn't ignore that and you made a way to infuse that into your career as it allowed you to, and then really follow that or just let it lead you, kind of. Because you said that you don't have a linear life. You're just like, this is where I kind of ended up. Yeah. I love that it wasn't planned and you kind of just follow. It's that whole thing about like following your excitement. You're a great example of that. You just kind of did that and ended up where you are now. So where are you now? What are you doing now?
Okay, so funnily enough, I think you're the first person that I'm announcing this kind of to. Really, I've told a couple of people in my life, but I recently accepted a new position. I left London to come back to New York about a year ago and finished a project with Laura Group and wrapped things up and handed them off to the 2 people who supported me at the group level. And then I was kind of like trying to figure out what I wanted to do. So I took like a hot minute after the pandemic to kind of just like breathe after everything had been so intense.
Which is amazing. And I wish more people could have done that and opted to
It
do
was
that.
so helpful. It was so helpful because honestly, you don't know what you want to do until you actually peel away layers and stop listening to noise and listen to what you want. I did end up going finally, after so many years of participating, finishing teacher training, which had always been like this unfinished thing for me. And then I did end up teaching, and I still am on Saturdays in Washington Heights at this nonprofit that really has an aims of creating a wellness center and like guiding youth, the local community through both like the yoga spheres as well as meditation. And then eventually we'll open up to a larger program. So I think it's a really lovely studio called Heights Yoga and Meditation. And then during that time, I was just asking myself questions. I had reached out to a friend. So I have like one friend who's a recruiter in this business who I've always trusted, who like placed me at Aperium, and who basically the conversations that we have are all the things that it's like a brainstorming session where I just say everything to her. She mentally like thanks it all. Don't hear from her for a while because she only comes to me when something's worthwhile. And
Perfect.
So she brought this group that's growing pretty rapidly and doing some really cool things, and just happens to be based in Portland, Maine, which is really, it's super random, but I ended up going up there. I love the owner of the group. He's young, excited, ambitious, intelligent, and I think he's done a lot of cool things already, things that are very difficult to do, but some of the development they have, which I'm not able to talk immediately about a ton of it.
Sure.
But there's some things that would be special in any municipality outside of the United States, but especially up there are like kind of groundbreaking. And he's really been dedicated towards pulling a lot of people from the food and beverage sphere because it's important from him from credible spaces. So like their director of human resources comes from the Dynex group, a group that's run by a very respected chef, Daniel Boulud, here in the city. Then there's, a chef that's running a successful restaurant for them who's from 11 Madison Park. There was another person who had worked at Per Se with Thomas Keller, and now they're bringing in somebody, I think, from Joel Robuchon. So he's clearly invested
Wow.
in curating people who have like done interesting things in the food and beverage space there. And which I always love when people are investing in the right people, because that's the most important part, right? Not
Sure.
saying that a pedigree matters, but it just says something about the group. And then I went to Portland and I was surprised at how cool it was. So
Maine is amazing. Maine is like magical.
it really is. It's like,
Yeah.
it's one of those things where there's so many different places where people, I think, have strong opinions. Like some people like hate the Hamptons. Some people don't like going to the Catskills, but I feel like nobody speaks poorly about Maine. And when I went up there, it just had like, especially the peninsula where I'm kind of looking for an apartment right now, kind of has this like feeling of quieter Brooklyn. Cobble Hill, like
Oh,
Carroll
nice.
Gardens, Brownstone, Brooklyn. It's a little bit quieter, but still has stuff. And the other thing that's very important to me is that the food and beverage scene punches above its weight compared to like the size of the city. Like there's a lot of
Mm.
good stuff going on there. And I think, quite frankly, with a lot of things that are happening in the world, global warming, et cetera, Portland might end up picking up to be like a hotspot.
Oh my God, I hope so. I spent a lot of time in Maine as a kid, and it's like a special place for my dad. He like loves Maine. So it would be really cool if it became a hotspot and more people could experience it because there's something really serene about it. Landscape is incredible. Yeah, it's just, it's very, I don't know. There's something ancient about Maine. I don't know what it is, but there's something
It
like
reminds me
ancient.
of Scandinavia. It reminds me
Hmm.
of the northern parts of the British Isles with maybe better weather. It feels like, very rarely in the United States, like with coastline, do you have a beach community that also has like a natural landscape that feels equally compelling and separate from it, right? I think a lot of times it's desert landscape or flat landscape that kind of pushes all of the focus on the beach. And it's like up there, the ocean, the waterfront is such a big thing, obviously, to main character, but like also the interior is so green, like the semi-mountainous, like ruggedness of it, the natural beauty. It's just also goes alongside it, which is really like, I think, amazing.
Oh my gosh.
So
So when do
yeah,
you
so
start?
so I start the 17th of July.
Okay, so you're gonna be a little maney.
Yeah.
That's so exciting. Are you gonna keep your spot in New York?
At this point, I am. I feel like it's
You're
been like a
never gonna.
constant. Yeah. It's been like a kind of a constant. And, I will always love New York. And like the cool thing about it is that, it's only 5 hours away if I decide to drive. Or honestly, taking a plane, it's like an hour and it's like up and down. It's not even an
Yeah.
hour. And Boston's like an hour and 40 minutes away. And Montreal's 5 hours away. So I feel like it'll just give me a different perspective. I am signing on to it. I sign on to everything with the idea that it's permanent.
Oh, that's
But I also,
interesting.
because I think it's always important to have like an idea that you're stuck in the present as opposed to like thinking about the future. And I think a lot of people are like, this is stepping stone to this and this is going to be next. And I always wonder if that doesn't allow them to actually enjoy what they're in the moment. Whereas like, I think if I walk into it where I'm like, this is permanent, then it's like a little bit more, there's like a little bit more of a mentality shift for me personally.
You can kind of
Um,
sink into it.
yeah, exactly. Exactly. I really loved it when I was up there. So I'm super excited about it. You and the entire family are welcome whenever you'd like to
Oh,
join.
Jesus. Thanks.
And I have a little puppy too who's driving.
I saw a
She doesn't drive right
tail
now.
walk by you. Wait, oh my gosh.
Yeah,
What's her
she is.
name?
Her name is Margot. Yeah,
So fancy.
Margot. She's
For-
6 months and she's a Rhodesian Ridgeback and Labrador blend. Yeah.
What? I have a lab. Oh my God.
Oh,
Did
yeah.
you meet Gus? Oh, you never met Gus when you were down here.
Oh,
Didn't bring him to dinner, obviously. That's amazing. So that's so exciting. Okay. I could like keep you on here forever, but I'm not going to do that. I have like a rapid fire,
okay.
5 question rapid fire that I call the afterglow. Okay. What advice would you give your younger self? And at what age would you give that advice?
I would go pretty early. I think I would tell myself when I was first starting out to trust my work to veer in the direction that it wanted to. instead of trying to control the direction that it went in. I think in the end, everything worked out the way that it was supposed to. I think that there were times where I expelled too much energy in trying to control the outcome or figure out what was next. Or, there's a lot of that ended up being really like waste of time. And I could have, I think, just enjoyed everything a little bit more if I had been less concerned about the next step and more like trusting that the next step was going to be there.
Cool. Yeah, that's a big one. What's the best career advice you've ever been given?
Might have been to move to New York City, right? But I think the best career advice I've ever been given was somebody who worked above me, who said that your body of work is the people who worked with you previously, not what you've done. And so their impressions of you, how you left them, whether you tried to like be positive or whether they did good things in their life because you maybe helped facilitate some of them, that's your body of work, not what you call your day job.
That is so awesome. That's like way better than I thought you were going to say. No, I've never heard that before. And that like hit me. Okay. What is your favorite quote?
Oh, my favorite quote is a quote that I learned in yoga like 15 years ago. It's, I have come to the frightening conclusion by Johann von Goethe. Do you know this? Okay. So basically goes something like, and I'm trying to remember it off the top of my head. I've come to the frightening conclusion that I am the decisive element. It is my mood that makes the weather. It is my temperature that create the environment that I'm in. And I'm obviously paraphrasing this quite a bit. I have tremendous power to hurt or heal, escalate or de-escalate situations. And if we treat people as they are, we make them worse. If we treat people as what they're capable of becoming, we help them become what they are meant to be.
Oh my God, that's great. That was impressive that you had that just like locked away in your head.
I think I probably butchered it more than you think that I did, but I will.
But still,
the gist of it is there.
The gist of it is there. Love it. Okay. What is the single best daily practice that you have in your life right now and why?
Absolutely. I think yoga. I think it could be walking too. I think anything that's reflective. I appreciate when I force myself into a routine that sets aside time towards things that I know will be impactful, whether it's chanting, whether it's meditation, whether it's a physical practice. I think having it, I recognize in my life the times where I let it, drop it and come back to it are less effective than if I have it like as a constant that I return to. And I think I'm much better at this age at making sure that things that I value are consistently present. Whereas like when I was younger, yoga's always been there or running has always been there, or whatever it is for different people, right? But I would let it go based on being distracted by shiny objects and things like that. And I think I've gotten better at making sure that every day I include some of that because I think the consistency is really, it's almost like, I hate this analogy, but like, they say antidepressants, right? Like I guess for most people, they don't work unless you take them for like 30 days consecutively or whatever the implant is.
Slow onset.
I think when you have that consistent practice of mindfulness in whatever sort of area it might occupy in your life, I think it's far more effective than if you dip your toe in it out of it. And so I think that also might be something that I recommend to my younger self to be more consistent with things that I value.
Yeah, that's good. That's a good one. And it is, I have noticed that too. Like Paulo and I have been trying to do that 5 a.m. magic morning hour before the kids wake up, because once they wake up, it's like chaos. And like yesterday, I was like, oh, you know what? I'm not going to do it. I'm just going to sleep. And I didn't have my coffee until like 10:30, which is just against the law. Like that, no one should have to.
It just changes the dynamic of things. I also will say that's a great practice is getting up before everyone else. Like there was a certain point where I switched maybe like 10, 15 years ago out of necessity to get up at 5 a.m. And I've never regretted it because
do you still do that?
Moment of silence when I wake up and you just have a little bit of time to yourself, it changes your brain, whereas like if you're constantly, I feel like it's like moving from your sympathetic nervous system to your parasympathetic nervous system. Like you're actually making decisions as opposed to running off of adrenaline. you know?
Yeah, I was just thinking like it's so different than waking up and just immediately like you're going until you go to bed and then wake up. It's like there's not really
I
a
think
rest.
parents especially need that. I think parents are the ones who have the least amount of time and they're the ones who could use it the most because I can say in my small world of having like a dog, even that, things become so much about someone else other than you, right?
Mm.
And how are you supposed to steer the ship if you have no centering for yourself, right?
Yeah, it's so tough, but it's worth it, even for dog parents. I was a dog parent before a human parent.
Oh, I know
And
you were.
yeah, poor Gus now is like so, oh, poor guy. But no, it's, I love, yeah, any kind of daily practice. And if you're not a morning person, it doesn't have to be in the morning, but the concept of consistency is huge. And I think once you can embed it into your life, so it just happens, it just really does show up. Okay. So my last question, and then I'll let you go. What is your go-to pump up song of the moment?
Oh, Let's Stay Together by Joseph. It's not
Okay.
really a pump up song, but it's like that super soulful, like sexy. I'm really into like neo soul and like British UK R&B that feels soulful. And I'm really into like that second coming of Nina Simone, which is always like my first wave of like, I love, love. And so for me, when I hear that, it just makes me want to start singing alongside it. And it's impossible for me to not have like a good mood.
Oh, I love it. I'm going to look it up. I'm going to look it up. What's it called again?
Let's Stay Together. And it's like a new cover of the song by Joseph, this artist. His name ends with an F. He's my
Okay.
all-time favorite artist at the moment. Like I love him and I love everything that he does. There's quite a few other songs. Some aren't as PG, so I'll leave it as that for this
It doesn't matter. It's okay. All right, cool. Well, thank you so much for coming on. And
You know how much love I have for you. And please, the entire family, you guys, I miss you. It's definitely time for me to get back down there. I think we would have seen each other sooner if not for the pandemic. I think it just ruined everyone,
sure.
But I'm going to make it down there and I'm going to give you guys all a big squeeze soon.
Thank you so much for tuning into this episode of Glow State. Please take a moment to subscribe to the show and then be sure to share it with a friend you know who would love a little glow in their life. I'll see you next time. Now, go glow.